Welcome, everyone. It is a couple of minutes before 1 o'clock. We're going to let you all arrive and get settled in, and we will begin promptly at 1. I don't know about you all, but I don't have children or pets to run into the room while I'm on conference calls, but I do have a husband who does that. Okay. It is officially 1 o'clock, so why don't we get started? Good afternoon. My name is Therese Brown. I'm the Executive Director of the Association of Catholic Publishers, and we welcome you to this afternoon's webinar on graphic design trends. This is part of what I am affectionately calling Catholic Publishers Summer School in lieu of our annual face-to-face membership meeting, which would have taken place last Thursday and Friday. For those of you who are ACP members, you might want to mark your calendars for next year's meeting, which is scheduled for June 3rd to the 4th, June 3-4, 2021 in Chicago again. And now that we've got that out of the way, I'd like to very quickly introduce you to today's 3 speakers who are going to lead us through this content. Joe Stella, Rob Schmidt, and Scott Oldham. I'm going to hand it over to them, and I will be monitoring any questions or comments that you have in the question or the chat area. We did have some earlier audio problems with a GoToWebinar this morning. The company it was a company-wide thing, and they've apparently resolved the problems. If there are any additional problems, I will try to let you know through chat and what I can find out. I'm going to mute my microphone, and I will no longer be on webcam as well, so you don't have to look at people sitting there. But anything else, I think Joe, Rob, and Scott are ready to take it over. And I am going to change presenters to Scott at this point in time. Scott, when you get that, accept it. And we will see your screen from now on. And if you have any questions, Rob can help you out with it. He just did this morning. So I'm going to hand it over to Joe, Rob, and Scott. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you very much, Teresa. Welcome. I'm going to share my screen. I hope everyone can see this opening slide.
That looks great.
Okay. So as Teresa mentioned, my name is Scott Oldham. I'm creative director at GLC, which is a content marketing agency just outside Chicago. I'm joined by one of my immediate work colleagues, Joe Stella, who is VP of Association Sales here at GLC, and one of our print partners, Rob Schmidt from Royle Printing. And I want to talk today about some publication design trends in a very broad sense. And I'm not going to focus on future trends. You can find for yourself articles about what colors are going to be hot this year or what all the new typefaces are. I'd like to talk about some trends that I've observed over the last couple of years that have really, in my view, influenced the design aspects that we use in what we do at GLC primarily, which are websites, publications for healthcare and association and financial services primarily. And I hope that what I have to share will be something that you can extrapolate towards whatever you're producing. And just to kind of level set here, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the technological and business changes that have driven some of these new design approaches that we have seen over the last, I'm really going to talking about a 10-year period. How it's really the convergence of design styles across media that have been reflective of this change, these technological and business changes, and where we are today with COVID-19 and how that's impacting our industry and how we're responding to those challenges. But to begin with, I'd like to ask our attendees to take the temperature of the industry, how many pages you currently publish annually compared with 5 years ago, just as a rough estimate. And when I say publish, that's anything, whether you're publishing books or magazines or catalogs or web pages. How many of those entities do you publish now? And would you say it's more, fewer, or about the same as what you were doing just 5 years ago? And if you could respond either with one of these responses or put it in your own words in the chat section, I think Teresa will be collating those. So while you do that, I'm going to launch in here. One of the trends that I've been most interested to see over the last couple of years is the way there has been a convergence of design styles in 3 major areas that previously were very, very separate and now have sort of been borrowing styles from one another pretty freely because of some recent technological changes. And those are newspapers, magazines, and websites. And I want to start delving into what the real nuts and bolts are of how that has happened to begin with. Because the main thing that happened was a pretty major technological change about 10 years ago. And it was in 2010 when CSS, or Cascading Style Sheets, which is a web programming language, began to incorporate support for TrueType and OpenType, which are 2 categories of typefaces. Prior to that, as I'm sure everybody knows, on websites, we were very, very limited in terms of what we could do typographically. As you can see in the shot on the left, which is a grab from the LA Times from that period, there was really no option other than using a sans serif typeface, which even then didn't render particularly well, because serif typefaces just weren't supported by either by the rendering on browsers or by the programming language that websites were built in. They would come out very jagged and really look terrible. After this development and the subsequent adoption of these typefaces by the most important web browsers, web designers really started incorporating a much broader family of typefaces into their websites and began using serif typefaces a lot more heavily because all of a sudden they could actually look good online. And what that has led them to do, as you can see on the right side of this, is to really start to try to mirror the print experience online. And again, you can see that pretty clearly with some very traditional print vehicles. And these are what their current websites look like. And while there has been a lot of borrowing back and forth about the structure of content since the web became kind of our primary vehicle for communicating information, to the extent that a lot of magazines and a lot of newspapers even structure their content in short bits or have stacked menus of content that they're teasing elsewhere in the publication. But now the reverse has happened. Now websites are borrowing the design aesthetics of newspapers in particular, and also some magazines, in the way that they structure things according to using a lot of rules to divide up the content and using, again, these serif typefaces, which previously they just didn't have access to. So what it creates, at least online, is a much more archival or antique reading experience that people traditionally would associate with print. And that has also worked in the opposite direction that I'll talk about in a minute. As for newspapers specifically, I think everybody knows that the American newspaper is not what it used to be. In the past 5 years alone, Daily newspaper circulation has dropped by 9 million. I'm sure in the last 3 months, it's gotten considerably worse. Since 2004, over 1,800 local print news outlets have closed altogether, which has left as many as 2,000 communities with no local newspaper at all. So the newspaper, as an everyday reading experience, has really disappeared from a lot of people's lives. There are new generations coming into the workforce now who really don't have a working familiarity with the way newspapers have been traditionally designed, for the reasons that newspapers have been designed that way. And they had a very, very different operating motive than magazines and websites. Magazines, on the other hand, have been doing just fine, despite what you may have heard about or have seen in the decline in broad lifestyle magazines or general interest magazines. Niche publishing has never been stronger. And as you can see, there were 7,218 magazines operating in the United States in 2018, which was an increase from the previous year. Now, this is a decrease from the biggest year that magazines ever had in this country, which was in 2012, but it's not that much of a decrease, as you can see. So the magazine industry, despite all the challenges that print is now facing in terms of advertising, and obviously in the last 3 months, things have gotten a lot worse for everybody. But generally speaking, that aside, it's been doing just fine. In terms of design, as I mentioned, there are very, very different goals for these two media in particular. For newspapers, as you can see on the right, even a reader-friendly thing like USA Today is maximizing its real estate on a page. There is absolutely no wasted space on a newspaper front page or anywhere inside of it because they can't afford it. I'm not saying that magazines can be free with their pages, but it's a different reading experience. The intention is a different reading experience where white space is a benefit. It helps to convey a more leisurely, a more thoughtful approach to the content than the urgent immediacy that's presented in a newspaper design. And historically, there hasn't been that much crossover for that reason. However, in the last 10 years, there has been some efforts made at incorporating magazine design aesthetics into a newspaper presentation. And I just want to look at this one case study here very briefly. The Chicago Tribune, which about a dozen years ago attempted to do a complete redesign along the lines of that image you see there on the far left. This was their prototype of sort of a magazine newspaper hybrid, which, as you can see, borrows a lot of the design approaches of what we would traditionally think of as a consumer magazine, where the images and the text overlap one another, where we have a very, very big dramatic image that doesn't convey any information specifically. It's there, again, to heighten the drama or the emphasis on the lead story. It may not surprise you to learn that, if you didn't know this already, that design went nowhere. This prototype was previewed and roundly rejected because presumably advertisers didn't like the mixture of a magazine style approach with newspaper content. Well, advertisers have become kind of secondary to this whole process now, and I'll just speak strictly for myself. I admire the initiative they took in attempting that. But with the subsequent 3 images, you can see how they've kind of gradually moved away from that over the subsequent years, kind of taking baby steps back from that magazine approach. You can still see in the second image, they're still basically trying to do that with that, the overlay of text and image, the stacking of the newspaper name, putting lots of teasers up above the main headline. But as they've gone along, they've dialed it back more and more until in the far right, you see it's basically the same as it ever was. It's just a newspaper layout, which is really not adopting any of the design aesthetics from either magazines or the web for that matter. Which just goes to show that there are some media that just aren't suited to that kind of tinkering. Whether it's justified or not, we'll never know, because unfortunately the newspaper industry simply doesn't have enough elements in it anymore to undertake that kind of experimentation. However, it has worked in the opposite direction. The disappearance of so much newspaper content and so many newspaper design elements has allowed magazine designers to adopt some of those styles and approaches to create the same sort of responses that newspapers traditionally generated from their audiences. And that is primarily a sense of immediacy, urgency, and newsworthiness. This is a spread from Sports Illustrated, where you can see them adopting some of those styles in very minor ways. For example, they're using all black text. Now, a lot of magazines use black text, but for newspapers, it's mandatory that most of the newspaper is one color. There's no option to use anything other than black text. These magazines clearly are four color. They can use as many colors as they want, but they're making a deliberate design decision not to use colored text. They're using all caps headlines. That conveys a sense of urgency, immediacy. They are screaming at you to read these headlines, and dialing back the color considerably in the same way that a newspaper would have to, in order to use the color a little bit more strategically. So the color comes through in the photography, of course, but then it's used to direct us to a few very important bits of information on the page, and then for the rest of it, it's not there. The black text handles the task of organizing the information for the reader on the page. Another example, this is from Popular Science. Again, very, very little color on the page, huge black all caps headline yelling at us, telling us this is the most important thing on the page. Again, as a newspaper would, and using those colored bits to direct our attention very, very strategically around the page. Very, very restrained layout that might not have flown 12 years ago. Another one, this is from Wired, where again, they're using the black text, or in their case, a very, very dark gray, all caps, again, yelling at us that these headlines are the important part. And they're using a condensed typeface for the headlines that would not have been inappropriate in a newspaper from about 100 years ago, where it would have been used exclusively to maximize space, to fit as many characters on a line as possible in order to get the maximum number of words into a very, very narrow column. Wired doesn't need to do that. They've got all the space in the world that they have to play with. They're doing it deliberately in order to build white space around the headline. It creates a jagged, uneven negative space that commands our attention. And then this is from Popular Mechanics, which is taking a very, very different sort of design approach from the other magazines I've shown you so far, because they've got a lot more to fit in. I'm exclusively showing departments here, that is to say the standing sections of the magazine that appear issue after issue after issue, because that's really where the hard work of the magazine gets done. Those signposts are the backbone of any magazine. The features are like a sandbox, and they don't really need to follow any particular rules. So that being said, the similarities between this and a newspaper aren't immediately apparent at first. However, notice that they're using very, very narrow columns in the same way that a newspaper would, although it's not justified text for the most part. So it's a much more comfortable, leisurely reading experience, even though they're kind of forcing us into that same format. And then the extensive use of rules, that is to say the lines that are separating this content. They're using them in several different ways. The big thick lines that you see under shop notes on the left page or under entrepreneurs on the right page are being used to help call attention to the department headers for these parts of the magazine. The rest of them are being used to separate content, to organize it and compartmentalize it so there's no confusion about reading from one item to another. There's a lot of different little text bits on this spread, and those rules are crucial in keeping it all from kind of merging together. And I will say that this retro look that they're incorporating here is popular for a magazine like this. As you can see on that left page, they've gone so far as to put a yellow background for no particular reason behind those two columns flanking the center. And I think it's significant that they've chosen whatever that is, about a 10% yellow, to put on that page, because it resembles, whether they mean for it to or not, a yellowing newspaper. It gives it a sense of history, a sense of stability, calling on, again, those same design elements that those of us who remember newspapers have been trained to look for over the years, and incorporating it into a design that is otherwise incorporating some very progressive and very web-friendly elements. For example, the table there in the middle of the column on the left page is something you could easily find on a website and would find on a website. So in order to put that into a more historic context, everything around it has this sort of past-driven antique feel. And I can't see the comment or the chat fields. Is there anything I need to address at this point, Teresa?
Scott, I don't see any particular on my side either.
Okay, thanks, Rob.
Mm-hmm.
So another question I want to throw out to the group is whatever you're producing in print has an online component to it, whether it is a website of that same or different content, a PDF version of whatever that entity is, or just nothing at all. Whatever you're doing is just exclusively delivered to your audience in print. Again, if you could please put your responses in the chat field. Again, I think Teresa would be interested in collating that. So now I'm going to move on to the only subject that's really worth talking about right now, which is, of course, how is our industry going to respond to the challenges that we have all witnessed occurring over the last couple of months? And I'm not going to talk about the business side of it. As I think we all know, there has been a huge contraction in print media, at least in terms of staffing, over the last couple of months. There are a number of publications that have gone under and many more that probably will follow before we're all done with this. But the upshot is that none of us knows. No one knows what the future is going to be for our industry after this is all over, if it ever truly ends. So what I want to talk about is the impacts that it's having on us from an aesthetic perspective right now, because some things have changed very dramatically, very quickly. And I want to talk about one area in particular and how we're addressing it, and to make some suggestions for anybody who might be struggling with some of the same issues. And it's a little too soon to say how it's going to affect design or typography in the ways that I've been talking about so far. But it's not at all too soon to talk about how it has affected our use of imagery. Because all of a sudden, there are some really well-worn cliches and some things that are not cliches, they're just very useful types of imagery that we can't use anymore because they're completely foreign to our everyday experience. No more crowd shots. When we're trying to show community or diversity, we just can't show people together like that. The current protests aside, it's really a foreign experience now. Same thing with handshakes. That may never come back. We don't know. So as a metaphor for partnership or 100 other things, you've got to find something else. And in place of that, we've begun to see how stock agencies, at least, and professional photographers are starting to respond to this. So we're starting to see more and more imagery with face masks, with social distancing, and isolation, which is going to be, for the duration, the new way of showing individuals and groups. Another thing that this has done, unfortunately, at least in our industry, is to kind of put a temporary end to in-person photo shoots. In our company, for example, we rely very heavily on doing custom photography with the subjects or the subject matter experts in our publications. And for the last couple of months, we simply have not been able to do that. But we are starting to make a tentative return to that, not just as things open up again, but as also we have found stopgap measures or workarounds. And I just want to share a couple of those with the group today in case you may be struggling with the same thing, or to invite your feedback if you've adopted any of these techniques or other ones that I haven't thought of. So to begin with, it is still possible to do a photo shoot. And I've seen this done from some other publications, to do a socially distant photo shoot. It requires a little bit more creativity and a lot of diligence. But if you can maintain your distance from between the photographer and the characters, it's possible to do this safely. One thing that we've been struggling with a lot is whether or not to include masks in the photographs. It's a real double-edged sword, because on the one hand, it's our reality now to show characters, particularly group characters, and I'm excluding the family that you see there on the right side. It's kind of a special case. But to include other groups of people without face masks right now raises a lot of questions. However, conversely, showing them with masks is just as problematic, because on the one hand, as a design aesthetic, it separates you, or separates the reader or the audience from the subject in a way that most other things don't. You're covering up half of the person's face. Their expression is a mystery to the audience. That really prevents the formation of a connection between the audience and the subject. This is why on magazine covers, of course, the subjects make eye contact with the audience. It's a means of trying to connect with people to get them, to entice them to buy that product. Well, we can't do that anymore. But the other thing is, it also reminds us of that uncomfortable new reality. So in our practice, we haven't really come down hard and fast on with masks or without. We're trying to do it both ways, and then making the decision afterwards, primarily based on what we think the audience is going to be most comfortable with. And that's the other thing that I would recommend for anybody who is embarking on socially distant photo shoots during this time, is to chronicle that process, as they've done in that photo on the right, where they've actually had a third party there to document the fact that the photographer and the subjects didn't get too close to one another. And hopefully if that woman turned her head, we could see she would have a mask on and so forth. But there's going to be somebody out there who sees the photo shoot and is going to wonder how it happened safely, and is going to challenge the publication to prove that they weren't endangering people to get this done, which is really a non-essential product right now. So having a documentation of that, I think, is very important to demonstrate that to people who are justifiably concerned about how this is being done. Another thing that we're exploring is doing illustrations, and doing not conceptual illustrations, but more portrait-based illustrations. And I want to show you a particular case study here. This is a publication that we do, or this is for a publication that we do, which is a quarterly, which typically in an issue has about 20 original photo shoots of its article subjects. And just to give you the full picture, this is for a healthcare concern out in New Jersey, which of course has been very, very badly hit by this coronavirus pandemic. So what we're doing is collecting supplied references from the subjects. That is to say, we're asking them to either send us selfies or some recent photograph of themselves where we have a pretty good view of their face. And that's it. That's the full extent of their involvement in the process. And that has been a major challenge in and of itself. But that being said, we can then get reference photos of a setting for whatever it is. And once we've decided we're going to go down this route, we really have a lot of freedom to select both the location and the appearance of that location. For example, you can see in this example, we've created a photo collage on the left side with an image that the subject sent us that's been kind of cut out of its background and placed over the proposed background, which is a landmark near where he lives, where he didn't happen to have the ability to shoot himself. And in creating the sketch for this, and this is not a finished illustration, we'll add color and refine it a little bit as we go along here, but just to show you how the composition can be cleaned up. For example, we can leave out the telephone lines there on the left side of the image. That tree that's there behind the monument, we don't have to show it with bare branches. We can make it look a little more full and lush and healthy looking. And the same thing with the character too. Well, obviously we want this to be as accurate as we can make it, but we can clean up any of the unfavorable details that the subject himself might object to if he ever saw the photo in print. The major drawback of this, of course, is that it's a lot more time consuming, and it's usually more expensive because, of course, you've got to hire an illustrator to collate all this stuff, and not to mention involving the subjects more. Which leads us into the third thing that we traditionally do, which is actually just work with those supplied photos that the subjects send. Now, this is probably the worst of the three approaches because you can't control for the poor quality of whatever is going to be sent in by the subjects. They don't know how to light a scene, and they may not have access to the equipment to do so. They don't know how to focus, and in fact, if they're taking this photo on their camera, they may not, on their phone, they may not even have that option. And they don't know how to compose a scene, and it's not their job to. We shouldn't expect that. So we know that what we're going to get is going to be less than optimal. What we have always advocated is if that's going to be the end result, don't try to hide it, feature it. So in this case, we've taken these fairly lousy photos from this event and just shown the audience these are snapshots. These aren't meant to look professional. They're not meant to rise to the same standard of some of the other photography in the magazine. We're putting this Polaroid frame around here because even though clearly these were not Polaroids and clearly they're not sitting on the page like this, to help communicate to you that we know it's not what we would normally choose in this case. Here's another example where, again, we knew we were going to get bad photos from the subjects, so we just said, all right, let's go all in on this and send us a selfie. Send us something that really looks like a selfie. And in the case of the woman there that I've enlarged, you can see somebody else took that photo. She didn't, that's not her holding up her own phone to take that photo, but she very gamely held her arm out to make it look like it could be. So if you don't look at it too hard or think about it too hard, it passes muster as a selfie. So again, we're communicating to the readers, yes, we know it's not the best photo, but we're putting in all this framework, all these underlying design elements to help communicate that to you that we know, and we hope that you know too. The other thing this helps do, to help make these people ambassadors for whatever this project is, because you're investing them in the process. Ordinarily, they might not even get contacted for a photo. Or if they do, it's a process that's very controlled and they don't have really any say over it. But here you're giving them the opportunity to really provide their own content in the magazine. And while they may not be happy with how they look, nevertheless, they at least can take some pride in having contributed to the layout in a way that they really wouldn't have had the opportunity to do otherwise. So, I don't know, if there's a way to spin something good out of it, I'd say you can look at it that way. Another challenge that we've been coming up against are people who just don't want to print right now, either for financial reasons or, more to the point, their audience isn't there right now. Their print audience might receive their publication or book or whatever it is at an office, and nobody's in the office right now to receive it. Meanwhile, this thing was already in process, and rather than letting the content get stale and just go to waste, they want to get it out there without incurring the cost of print or without compromising their audience. So they're resorting to, at least in our experience, in a lot of cases, to online PDF flip books, which I'm sure everyone here is familiar with, where you take the PDF or the portable document format version of your publication and throwing it into a CMS that replicates as much as possible on a desktop the experience of turning a page and reading a magazine in order. The advantage of this, of course, is that you can, as I said, preserve your content, and it's also a production process that's completely consistent with the printed version. You don't really have to do anything differently in order to produce this. But if you are strategic about it, there are a lot of things you can add to it. And a lot of these platforms now are incorporating many, many more web-friendly bells and whistles than they used to. It used to be really restricted to just flipping the page, but now there's a lot more stuff that can be added that really replicates the experience you get on a website, despite the fact that the content is still kind of locked into this PDF flipper format. So there's a lot more advertising options available now. You can have interstitial ads or banner ads that retain throughout the course of the publication or that appear in sidebars. The text is now searchable within the platform, although for the most part, and I'll ask Rob to talk a little bit about this more in a minute, I don't believe that it is searchable by Google. So doing this long term is not going to help anybody's SEO, but at least it is searchable within the context of the individual platform experience. As is sharing, which was a long time coming to these online platforms, but now is pretty good to the point where you can drill down to an individual article and share it independently of the entire publication, which was a big development when it happened. And to acknowledge the fact that most of the audience, maybe about half of it, is going to consume this content on something other than a desktop. I think it's pretty clear that this kind of format does not translate well to a smartphone. It just doesn't. The magazine size, no matter how you pinch and zoom it, assuming it responds to those commands, isn't going to look good, isn't going to be a good reading experience on a smartphone. So what most of them do is have a text-only view that's available. So if all you're interested in is consuming the actual text of the article, you can scroll down the page more or less as you would on a website. It's not the smoothest experience. Doing it as a responsive website would be better overall for a portable device format, but it's usable. It's not that bad. And I'll throw this over to Rob because he may have access to a few more of the recent features that I'm not necessarily up on.
Right, that's all right. Yeah, thank you, Scott. And there are a couple of chat questions on there, back to your second question, so we can go over those too as you move on. But yeah, the digital feature, I mean, of course, as Scott said, due to COVID, it was a scramble. Publishers realized that because of their advertisers, in most cases, they were pushed back with this idea that the books were not going to get to the homes or to the businesses actually, and these people were all at home, so it was a scramble quickly to get a digital version done of their book. So we had a number of people go down that path. There are a number of technologies in there. The HTML5 setups now have made these books more sliding of pages versus flipping of the pages, and that has made it a little better on iPads and mobile devices in those areas. So those are some improvements too that continue to evolve with those features, but still not ideal, as Scott talked about. And then there's a lot of people that are putting video features in. We have a number of magazines that will take that various content and add video to those digital productions that we're seeing quite often. And there's a few other features within those designs and creations of digital pages that you can involve. You know, obviously the easy connections to the web through activating all the HTML links and so forth. But it's a change by all means by offering those features, but they ride along and they complement that print element in the end. Scott, are you able to see those questions on chat?
Not while I'm in slideshow, but I'll end this.
Let me know when you want those reviewed. I can read them out to you.
Exit here and I'll bring up the chats.
Okay.
Hi guys, this is Therese again. Thought I'd just step in and say I don't see any questions on either the chat or the question bar. So I think we probably can conclude at this point.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you everybody for coming. Just a reminder for those who are interested, there is still another webinar tomorrow on fulfillment and inventory and another on Friday about how the world wants to make all content free, especially Amazon. So check those options out in the calendar at the ACP website, catholicpublishers.org, and we hope to see you again soon. Don't forget, you will get a final email with a link to the recording for this session that you may review yourself as well as share with others. The video will also be posted at the ACP website under webinars for any future viewing. There are also additional webinars viewed there as well. If you have any questions, please contact me at the ACP website. And thank you again for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.